What would you have me to say? What more would you have me to say? To open my mouth and midwife words is labor. You want my tongue contracting. To give birth to precious offerings that will be at best infantilized until they grow teeth. Reduced to negligible is all I can hope they grow to be nightly. I'm tormented in prayer that they grow up, that they grow up, that they grow to land on paper, in hearts and minds, and out of mouths as new founts of wisdom. My prayer is a dream. They took my prayer in her dreams. We all hope to die in our sleep, but not like this. Not robbed so violently of our peace. Left for 20 minutes to let our words leak from our seams. These defenders of the American dream are a special kind of thief. That's still more than matter, than blood and flesh. They come seething enmity, onerously seeking our prayers before they can intercede, before they touch oxygen, before they breathe heaven, and yet it is the heaven in us that they can't seem to kill. If it were my will alone, I wouldn't give birth to another word in this wretched earth. Would sew up the womb of my heart, choose mute impotence over the incessant murder of my most holy art. But as God would have it, I haven't been more fertile. My tongue more flexible, my labor so light. These contractions are no match for the injustice my DNA knows, and as sure as I know that there was an Emmett, there was a Brianna, there was a Trayvon, an Eric, there was a Sandra, there was an Emmanuel AME, there will be more. And so I bear down for war, and I push out an Nzinga, an Onyx, a Toussaint L'Ouverture, a Sada, an Afeni, a Tupac Shakur, a Bazomba, a Beyonce, a Barack, a Booker T, an Ella Baker. Bitch, I'll push out me. More fearless than I could ever imagine to be, and I'll breathe so unapologetically that it'll take their breath away. Deliver a death blow for every bell toll, with every breath I take.
We want to say thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you on behalf of the San Francisco Foundation for joining us for another Arts Thursdays, where the goal of the Arts Thursdays is to highlight the progressive work and change that's taking place in the Bay Area arts and culture community, and to hear and see how Bay Area working artists and cultural strategists are reimagining the community and our rootedness, our belonging, and our civic engagement. So this Thursday, we are featuring the phenomenal Center for Cultural Power. Center for Cultural Power works at the intersection of civic engagement, social justice issues affecting marginalized communities, and power building amongst BIPOC grassroots cultural hubs. What I love about Center for Cultural Power, that it is all about artists transforming their communities and their cities through political power. And today we have with us Favianna Rodriguez from the Center for Cultural Power. And Favianna, I want to say welcome and thank you, thank you, thank you. And in the background, we have Joy, and we want to say welcome, welcome, welcome to the both of you, but I'll be speaking directly with Favianna Rodriguez. So welcome, Favianna, and thank you for joining us for the San Francisco Foundation Arts Thursdays.
Thank you so much. And I'm excited to be here, and thank you to the San Francisco Foundation for always supporting the arts.
When did you first fall in love, with the arts?
Well, I grew up in Oakland, California during the era of the war on drugs, and it was a a tough decade, those years when, my community was experiencing so much inequality. And at the same time, I would walk through my neighborhood and look at the murals. I would hear hip hop music. It was the 80s and the 90s. And I would see the remnants of Black power throughout my community in the Fruitvale, an immigrant neighborhood in Oakland. And I realized as a kid that these images, whether it was murals depicting the Aztecs or depicting farm workers, really depicting the beauty of our community, these types of artworks gave me life and they inspired me to also create.
I'm thinking about young people right now in the midst of a pandemic where there's so much uncertainty about how to even respond, how to voice their concerns, how to even be a part of the conversation about social injustices that are taking place. And a lot of times the arts is that safe space to recover, to reimagine, and to rebuild for not just our young people, but our communities as a whole. So I'm glad you mentioned that, and I'm glad you raised that, because it is about how do we show up? How do we show up as citizens? How do we show up as human beings and communities? And arts, I always feel, is that place, that safe space for us to be able to figure out and explore how do we show up, in a much better way with each other. So thank you for that. So one of the main questions I want to ask you is, as we talk about narrative shift, what are the narrative shift projects or issues that Bay Area artists are working on right now, and as well with the Center for Cultural Power?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that you brought up the power of what it means to create. I think when people think the arts, they think it's just about making something or participating in a drumming circle or maybe painting something. But in reality, what the arts is, and really what cultural practice is our ability to tap into our imagination and envision a future that is not yet here. It also allows for us to cope with the realities of our world. For me, of course, that was the impacts of drugs and violence in my community. But for a lot of youth today, it's the impacts of being isolated, the impacts of the climate crisis, right? Climate grief, or even just the impacts of knowing that we are at a time when there's so much death around us because of the pandemic that's disproportionately affecting communities of color. So art and culture give us tools to speak to the heart, because I can give someone a research paper with all the data, but data speaks to our rational minds, whereas art and culture speaks to our heart and it speaks to our imagination, and it's very, very powerful. And so when we look at the power of culture and we also think about the issues that artists most care about, artists in the Bay Area, because of over 20 years of gentrification in our communities, we are dealing with a housing crisis. Many of the artists that we work with at the Center for Cultural Power are also educators. And so they're dealing with the impacts on schools. In the city of Oakland, there is school closures being discussed right now. And it's artists that we have worked with who are going out there, doing impromptu concerts, just bringing all of their creative tools to help everyday people feel the issue, but also to imagine and propose a pathway forward. And so the kinds of narrative shifts that we are working on first is that we need to shift the idea of artists in society, right? In the pandemic, we realized that artists are actually very critical to our world, because it's artists who can help get us out to sing, to dance in our homes, to create, right? Artists keep us entertained. Artists are the light in the tunnel, especially in times of hardship. I think that for many times people think artists, oh yeah, artists are cute, they're cool, they're fun. But we're not necessarily making space for artists to lead organizations, for artists to be entrepreneurs. And yet here we are in one of the most entrepreneurial spaces in the entire country. How are we cultivating artists to build their infrastructure, to build their institutions, to create their music schools, to launch their films, to be able to, jump into the entertainment industry, to be able to build a cultural organizations that are going to have long-lasting impacts in our community?
this idea of shifting the role and leadership and engagement of artists, right, as power builders. That's right. Dancing, singing, the practice of it is a beautiful thing, but then there's the people of it too, and the power building part of those people, the leadership of those people in their communities. When we talk about the next, and I feel like what you're talking about is the next level of artist engagement. What does the next level of artist engagement look like? Are we standing on the shoulders of those people in the 50s and 60s and 70s that were a part of the cultural nationalist movements all over the world, speaking on behalf of marginalized people, historically marginalized people all over the world, where arts and politics was never separate. It was always one and the same. So as we talk about Artist 2.0, artist engagement, artist leadership 2.0 or 3.0, whatever you want to call it, what kinds of infrastructure do artists need to do this kind of transformative work within their cities and their communities as we look at political power building?
Yes. Thank you also for naming that we stand on the shoulders of giants, on the shoulders of James Baldwin, Nina Simone, folks like Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Joan Baez, right? And this was the generation of artists who were really looking to make sure that they had a seat at the table and that they were able to influence. They were able to open the door for my generation. And now my generation, not only do we want a seat at the table, we want our own table. We want our own studios. We recognize that in order to really build cultural power at the rate that we need to, knowing that our communities have been extracted from culturally, because it's not that our culture has not been profited from it. It definitely has, but we have not been a part of decision making, and that's across cultural industries, right? And so whether it's on marriage equity, whether it's Black Lives Matter, addressing police brutality, it's artists and cultural people in sports, people in television and film, singers, musicians, who are the ones who help build the public will for policy change. So we need cultural change before we can have political change. And so what we do at the Center for Cultural Power is we help train artists on their leadership, on the potential impact that their cultural work can have, but also on their ability to shape politics. And what that means is, moving away from this idea that the artist is just here to entertain. No. The artist is also here to create a fertile ground for policy wins, right? And so in order for artists to do that, artists need to understand political power. They need to also have spaces where, as artists, they can show up as their best self. And so what we do is we create spaces that are artist-centric, that in which artists can use their tools, and we can gather and think about strategy, right? And so when we're thinking about influencing a city council meeting, we think about, what is the visual art we can create? What are tools that we can share with artists all across our region so that they can also they can participate? And it's also about, bringing our tools of culture. We know how to move people. That's why we're artists, right? We speak to something which is the heart space. And sometimes politics really just speaks to your head space. But as artists, we can help tell these stories. We could help move people to participate in the political system. And that's what we do. And so here in Oakland, as we are coming up on an opportunity to imagine Oakland, what is Oakland 2045 going to look like? What's Oakland going to look like in the next 20 to 25 years? I'm thrilled that we're able to work with artists in being part of that process, the process of reimagining, right? Cultural hubs. Imagine if our cities had hubs where we could interact with culture. We have spaces to dance, to make music, to have cultural celebrations. That's what thriving cities can be. But you will need artists at the table to make sure that we are not just instrumentalized, but that we are also helping to shape a vision and ensuring that artists can continue to live here, that they have economic opportunities, and that they are working hand in hand with social justice organizations who are making change.
That's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's powerful. It's artistic. It's articulate. All of that.
Thank you.
One of the things that stood out for me was when you said creating a fertile ground, right? Artists are the ones who create the fertile ground for policy change. And I think people need to remember that. They need to recall that. They need to reimagine that. What does that look like, taste like, feel like? How does it show up in our communities? And intergenerationally, how does that show up? You know, to create fertile ground for basically, how do we think? Like you said, what are our belief systems? And our belief systems then allow us to say, how do we make choices? And how do those choices then get implemented and create action? So I appreciate you, Favianna, for taking the time to be with us here at the San Francisco Foundation Arts Thursdays. I appreciate you and the work that you and Center for Cultural Power is doing and holding that work for the Bay Area community as a whole. I appreciate Joy Tang and Jamie for being in the background, holding us down as we have this conversation, and all those who support Arts Thursdays and Center for Cultural Power. And we look forward to a continued partnership with you.
Thank you so
thank you.
much. Thank you, everyone.